Hi, I'm Brent Weaver. I am a teacher and musician and composer and home cook. And I've been cooking for families for almost 50 years. And so I've been encouraged, especially during this time of quarantine and isolation, to help some of my friends know how to cook good, basic, nutritious food that is inexpensive and easy to do. So that's what we're after, good and cheap. And I hope to talk with you a little bit today about some basic techniques, about basic equipment. And then we're going to make a very simple dish of rice and beans that I learned when I was in Central America in college. So let's start first of all talking about equipment. You don't need a whole lot of fancy equipment to do good cooking. I am fortunate to have a beautiful kitchen that my wife designed for us, and she did most of the installation as well. But I cooked for years on an old stove that had basically one good burner. And you can cook with very little equipment. What I've got out here right now is one skillet, one saucepan with a lid, one good knife, and a cutting board. And that's really, and a measuring cup. And that's pretty much all we're going to need to make this dinner today. I also got a really good idea from a cook on the Food Network a number of years ago. Rachel Ray did a series called 30-Minute Meals, and she kept talking about having a garbage bowl that you could put peelings and stuff, debris from your cooking into, and that's been one of the best ideas that I've ever gotten. What I did here was I just pulled a bowl out that I had had something else in. I didn't even need to wash it first because we're going to put garbage into it as we go. So let's talk about procedures here, and then we'll actually get to cooking. One of the other things that's really important to remember as you cook is to, first of all, be patient with yourself and realize that pretty much anything you do is still going to be edible and it's going to be good. So feel free to experiment. The other thing is preparation is really a good thing. The French term mise en place simply means everything in its place. And it's one of those things that's really, really valuable for any type of cooking. So what I've done is to set out the stuff that we'll need. First of all, the pots, my garbage bowl. I'm going to use an onion, like I said, my cutting board and knife. Here's the water we're going to need. I've got some leftover rice because I'm going to do that old cooking show trick of starting something and then pulling out the finished dish. I have a little bit of cilantro from the grocery store and a few herbs and spices and a can of beans. And that's pretty much all we're going to need today. Now, let me show you a decent technique for cutting up an onion. Surprisingly, this is one of those things that basic cooks talk about a lot, and I frankly have done it a bunch of different ways over the years. What I like to do, and I learned this from a chef friend of mine, is to cut the stem end of the onion. See, the onion grows like this, right? The roots are down here, the stem is up here, and then that dries off and falls off. So I'm going to cut the stem end and leave the root end intact. By the way, one thing I did, I'm going to put this in my garbage bowl. One thing that's important to know is that no matter whether you have fancy knives or cheap knives, it's important that they be sharp. Dull knives are actually more dangerous than sharp knives because with a dull knife, you may have to press harder, it could slip, and so it's always a good idea to keep your knife sharp. I used my sharpening steel, we'll talk about that some other time, to quick get this started or get this sharpened up a little bit before we started this morning. Okay, so I'm going to go now and I'm setting the flat end that I just cut on the cutting board. Going to go up here to the root end and cut this in half, and then I can get in there and take the paper off. Sometimes I take the top layer off. I used to worry about that being wasteful, but onions are cheap. So we'll go in there and take off the top layer, and we've got a usable onion ready to cut. The best way I find to actually get the onion cut now is, and I think we can see this on the, I'm actually using two cameras here. I'm just getting really, really high tech. What I do is to use my knife and to cut downward, not all the way through, to about the size I'm going to want, all the way across. Now, a really well-trained chef would do this so that the pieces were all the exact same size, and then would use the knife horizontally to cut it into small dice. I'm a home cook. I'm not going to worry that much about uniformity because I'm not really worried about making my food pretty. Anyway, so now that we've got those lengthwise cuts, we can cut across, and you can see that this just falls into dice. Now, basic knife technique. It is important to keep your fingers away from the knife. And so, you know, it's one of those things that it sounds like a well, duh kind of moment, but it's one of those things that we need to remember. So it's always good advice to turn your knuckle or turn your fingers under and use your knuckles to kind of hold the food. Sometimes when I get down to this root end, I'll turn it a little bit like that and then get as much out of that onion as I can because I'm cheap. So I'm going to set this aside for a few minutes, and we're going to start on our rice. I wanted to talk a little bit about how to do rice today because it's one of those basic kitchen skills. If you can make yourself rice and if you have a can of beans, you're never going to go hungry. And these things are cheap. As a matter of fact, I was noticing in the grocery stores these days, with all the grocery buying around the coronavirus pandemic, that rice and beans were some of the first things to sell out at the store. What I've done is I've taken 2 cups of white rice and I put it in a strainer and ran some water over it. I used to not worry about rinsing rice, but I find it actually does taste better when you do it. So I found it's a small step that really works well. If you don't have a strainer, just put it in a bowl and then add some water to it, swish it around with clean fingers, you know, use a couple of changes. Your best tools are your hands. James Beard always used to say that. Just use your hands, swish it around, use your hand to strain it out. Do a couple of changes of water and you'll get the rice rinsed out nicely. So I'm going to put this in my pan, and then I have measured 1.5 cups of water, which is what the direction says on the package. 1.5 cups of water for each cup of rice. I have 2 cups of rice here, therefore 3 cups of water. You can add salt or not. You can add fat or not to rice as you cook it. That's completely your preference. I have also seen the way I first learned to do this was to boil the rice or boil the water first and then add the rice. I find it's just as easy to go ahead and put the rice and the water together, start them cooking, and fortunately I have a stove where things boil very quickly. While this is starting to boil, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about where this dish comes from. When I was in college, I was part of my college's international studies program. Actually, the college I attended, Goshen College in Indiana, requires all students to live abroad for at least 1 term. And so I went to the study service unit in Costa Rica, which I loved. It was wonderful. And one of the national dishes there is called Gallo Pinto, and the Spanish for that simply means painted rooster or a spotted rooster. Gallo is a rooster, and Pinto means spotted. And I think it's called that because of the white rice and the black beans. It's a super simple dish, but it is one of those dishes like pizza or chili or something like that in American culture that you can change and adapt to whatever you have available. And that makes it good, practical food. You can use this to, you can add, subtract up and down the line for this. And the only real necessary ingredients are rice and beans, black beans usually, although you can use red beans if you want. Again, nobody, the food police are not going to come in and tell you you can't use those kinds of beans in Gallo Pinto. So I'm going to get a good wooden spoon here. I see that this is starting to heat up. As soon as this hits a good boil, I'm going to put the lid on my pan and turn this down to low heat. I'm going to put a little bit of olive oil in here too. I like the flavor of it, and it helps keep the grains of rice from sticking together. You can also use butter, you can use coconut oil, or you can use nothing at all if you want. Now the important thing with rice is that you can cook it in a lot of water like you would cook spaghetti and then drain it off. The way I like best is simply to steam it. So once this boils, I'm going to cover this and, like I said, turn it down to low heat. And then it is important that for the next 15 minutes, you do not touch the pan. You don't peek, you don't lift the lid, you don't stir anything. As Alton Brown on Good Eats used to say, just walk away. Just walk away. So we're going to let this start going, and it looks like it's just about to boil. And I will do what I often do in the classroom, which is try and do a little verbal tap dancing until what I need to do is ready. So anyway, this is Gallo Pinto from Costa Rica. Most cultures have some sort of grain and bean dish. For example, in India, there's dal and rice. In Mexico and all sorts of Latin cultures, rice and beans is a standard thing. Beans and tortillas, of course, in Mexican culture, where we get tacos and enchiladas and burritos and all sorts of other yummy stuff. Okay, our rice is starting to boil, and I don't know if it'll get done by the time we get this program done, but all I would do is turn this down to low heat, set the lid on, turn the timer to 15 minutes. And then at the end of 15 minutes, you can just turn the heat off and let it sit for another 5 or so minutes to finish steaming on its own. If you go ahead and let this cook, it's generally not going to stick if you keep the heat low enough. All you need to do is just make sure that it's going at a slow simmer. I'm fortunate in having a glass lid for my pan. Now it's boiling good, so I'm going to give it a stir, and that's the last I'm going to touch it until it's done. I'm going to put the lid on, turn the heat down. On my stove, it goes from 1 to 9 and then high, so I'm going to leave it at about a 2. I'm going to set my timer, 15 minutes, and give it a start. Now, through the magic of being prepared, I'm going to pull out a dish of leftover rice that I had in the refrigerator, and this dish is always kind of best with leftover rice anyway. My son and I have been known to eat mass quantities of rice, so we're not going to have too much by any means. I'm going to take my big skillet here and set it on my large burner and get it heating up to medium heat or so. I don't want it too hot. like I said, my stove goes from 1 to 9, and then low and high at either end. Usually for most cooking, like when I'm sautéing onions and things like that, I'll run it at about a 5 or a 6. I started this on 9 to boil it, the rice, and then turned it down to 2 for the steaming and simmering. Okay, so my pan's heating up here. Again, I'm going to use olive oil. You can use canola oil, peanut oil, butter. Butter you need to be a little bit careful with because it burns easily. You can use coconut oil. Any sort of good vegetable oil is going to work well. If you have a little bit of bacon fat left over from something, you can put that in as well. And I'm going to add probably about 2 tablespoons of oil to the pan. It's not an exact measurement. If you want to measure it to start out with, you want to know how to eyeball 2 tablespoons, that's great. Go ahead. All right, so I've got my chopped onion here, and I'm going to set it in the pan with the hot oil, and it's going to sizzle. And we're going to let that cook on medium heat for just a couple of minutes until it starts to soften, and it is already smelling wonderful. So while that's going,
move the handle.
Oh, so we move the handle. My bride is giving me help as I'm going here. This is the first one we're doing, so hopefully we work out the bugs as we go along with it. Now, one of the things that's important to do as you're cooking is to season things as you go. I have some nice kosher salt in a little dish here, so I'm going to take a couple of pinches of that and sprinkle them over the onions. That salt, by the way, is also going to start to pull water out of the onions so they'll cook a little faster. And then a few grinds of black pepper. I'm fancy with the pepper grinder. You can get pre-ground black pepper. It's fine. It works just great. So now this is sizzling nicely, and whatever kind of onion you use, yellow onions, white onions, I like red onions, whatever kind of onion you use, you'll notice that when you put them into the oil, they're opaque white. The flesh of the onion is opaque white. What you want to do is cook these until they start to turn a little bit translucent. What that does is not only to soften them a little bit, but the flavor gets milder, and believe it or not, some of the compounds that really make onions strong smelling when they're exposed to heat, especially dry heat, then they turn sweet. And so that's what makes onions turn sweet as you cook them. Alrighty, so we're getting a nice color on these onions. And then all we need to do is to take our leftover rice. We are not going to be ceremonious about this at all. And I have made sure I have clean hands. By the way, the latest information we have about food safety, it's always important to have clean hands when you make food, but also that the coronavirus, COVID-19, does not do well with heat. So if you heat your food, it's going to be great. If you get takeout or something like that, if it's something hot, giving it a short zap in the microwave is going to kill whatever beasties might be there. There's no evidence that anybody has seen so far that food has been a vector for transmission of COVID-19. So we're very fortunate that way. Alrighty, so my onions are doing good. I'm going to give them another stir, and I'm going to just take my hands and crumble the rice in there. You can see where this would be a good dish for leftovers, right? Okay. Then I'm going to go quick and rinse my hand off. Get the rice sticky stuff off of it. And then start to stir it around. Now, if you've got a good nonstick pan or a well-seasoned cast iron or carbon steel pan, this wonderful carbon steel pan was a gift from my family for my last birthday. It is like my favorite thing ever. But if you stir it around and you give it a little bit of oil, then things will not stick. And day-old rice will actually do better than this than freshly cooked rice, because the starch in the rice actually hardens overnight as it cools. So there's the rice starting to cook. And add a little bit more salt and a little bit more pepper and a can of black beans. Now, if you cook black beans on the stove, God bless you, they are wonderful. They are easy to do. We'll save that for another time. I like good canned black beans. I generally go for the organic ones. What I've done is to just simply drain off most of the liquid. You don't need to, have a fetish about it. But then I'll put that in the pan. And sizzles and starts to smell yummy. All we really need to do with the beans right now is heat them through, because they're already cooked. And it's a shame we don't have smell-o-vision. You should smell this. It smells really good. Now, you can season this however you like. Black pepper and salt, sure. In Costa Rica, they have a sauce that's really just available there called salsa lisano. The closest thing in American cuisine that I can get to is Worcestershire sauce. So sometimes I add a splash or two of that, maybe a teaspoon if you're measuring stuff. A little bit of ground cumin, again, small amounts of this. A little bit of spice goes a long way. And a little bit of oregano that gives it kind of a genuine Latin American flavor. Central American cooking, like in Costa Rica and a lot of the other Central American countries, is not spicy in the way that Mexican cooking is. They don't like heat quite so much, although you do find hot foods. But it is very, very savory. Lots of good use of spices. Okay, so I'm just kind of stirring this around, and it's sticking a little bit to the bottom of the pan, but that makes a good crust that I can then use my wooden spoon to scrape up. So if it starts to stick, don't panic. And what I could even do would be to maybe take like a teaspoon or so of water, put that in there at the end. That would loosen that crust on the bottom of the pan. But right now, all I'm going to do is take a little bit of this cilantro that I had in my refrigerator, and I'm going to take just the very top part. If you don't like cilantro, then leave it out. Some folks don't like the flavor of it. I hated it when I first tried it. Now I love it. It's part of Latin American cuisine, Chinese, all sorts of Asian cuisines. It's a unique flavor, but you can use parsley, basil, even mint would taste great on this. Now, since we just have the two cameras, I'm going to bring this over to my second camera, and you can see the finished dish. I don't want to set a hot pan on my granite counter, but there is the finished dish. Now I wonder if that's been showing for us. We will see. It could be that the phone turned off at some point and it's now shooting the ceiling, which would be really disappointing. But there's our finished Gallo Pinto. And you can see I can scrape that off the bottom. If you want, you can add a scrambled egg to this, any kind of leftover meat that will increase the protein. But one of the things that a lot of third world cultures discovered is that combinations of grain and beans give you complete protein, or grains and seeds or nuts, or grains and dairy, or any of those two have incomplete proteins that then can complete each other when you serve them together. So for example, rice and beans gives you a lot of good protein along with starch and along with being filling. When I was in Costa Rica, the father in the family I lived with used to joke that we have beans and rice for breakfast, rice and beans for lunch, and Gallo Pinto for supper. So it's something that is nourishing, it's good, and it's easy to do. So give this a try, see if it helps you. We'll be, along with other things, other simple recipes to try. In the meantime, take care of each other. God bless you. See you soon. My wife just reminded me to add one bit of information, which is that you can find these videos at toneweaver.com. That's my professional musical website. I also have a YouTube channel where I'll be posting these. So thank you much. See you later.